I'm Cindy Gwelly. I'm currently the president of AOI, and welcome to our May meeting. We have a recap of our April meeting, in which we had Diana Parcell talking about Eliza Sidmore and her influence on bringing the cherry trees to Washington. That is recapped in our newsletter and also online. So if you missed that, be sure to go and check that out online for the video, because it was absolutely fascinating. She did a terrific job with that. And I'm going to have those serve as our official account of the meeting, for our records, unless there are any objections. Once, twice. So thank you, Rick. We'll have that as our official record. I'm going to quickly pass this along to Carolyn for our membership and our treasurer reports.
Membership. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. No matter how many times I do, they'll have to be reminded. We have new members that have joined who are here for the first time, and I wanted to introduce them first. Diane Persky, I'm sorry. Give her a warm welcome. And her husband. Can you stand so everybody can see you?
Behind the column.
Welcome. And since our last meeting, and your husband, Mark. Daryl. Okay. Well, can you stand so?
It's the husband she brought this time. Yeah.
Mark Conheedy was another new member who was brought in by Virginia Dale. I think I introduced him last time. Alvin Owens, who was introduced, he's retired, an alum of Cardozo High School, and learned about AOI from our late member, Alfred Montgomery. The Frenches were here last time, but they hadn't gotten their invitation in. And now I think they're en route to France. So, and he has a long, he learned about AOI from Carl Cole. His great uncles, Daniel Chester French, was the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial statue, and Benjamin B. French served 4 presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. Let's see. Then we have Jeffrey Henry, who is here today. He's a descendant of the Henrys of D.C., and he's an architectural historian. Would you like to say anything? Or? Thank you for having me. We'll get you
I'm a fifth generation Washingtonian. The Henrys first came here just shortly before the Civil War, and my great-great-grandfather was a Civil War correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then his son, Samuel Henry, started sort of a specialty grocery store at the corner of 19th and Pennsylvania Avenue. So.
Welcome. Thank you.
And Brian Beatty, who's not here, is from Stamford, Virginia, and he's a retired federal officer, born in D.C., and descended from Alan Cole. So we also have some visitors. Well, we don't have, not a visitor, but, pardon me?
I was just saying, I want to join, but I realize that, you have to vote on the person.
No, you. No. Well, I'll talk.
I have your brochure right here for you.
Introduce yourself, and we'll vote you in right now.
If I'm talking too loudly, go like this and I'll stop. Oh,
Stand up so we can see you.
well, I went to school in Fairfax County, and my father, after he was a diplomat, we came and lived in the D.C. area, and I grew up in Springfield. I was born in Minnesota, and I'm a Humphrey Democrat, and or my father was, and I wanted to join this organization. When I read about it, I was very, very impressed, and I said, how did you not know this? But I've lived in on the corner of New Mexico and Cathedral for 33 years with my husband, but he passed away in June.
Sorry.
But he's fine. He's up there, and he's not suffering, so it was just a sudden thing.
Well, we'll tell you how to join.
Oh, Rebecca Ellertson.
Are you going to conduct the election?
Do I or does Cindy? I don't know. We've never done this before. Cindy, do you want to?
Well, the election is we welcome you. I will use the power of my position to welcome you in and say any objections. I'm taking the applause as your official election. So welcome.
Well, since we're doing this, we have a member a prospective member who's been here before and has requested information about joining. And since she's here, can we introduce
Absolutely.
you too? Her name is Janet Nunn. She was introduced to AOI by Mark Onmacht. Ugh.
I'm going to be very quick. I'm Janet Nunn. I'm 81 today. I'll be...
Happy birthday.
Correction. I meant to say that I'm currently 81, but 2 months from today, I should be 82. I'll be 82 in July. I was born July 11, 1941. The most interesting thing right now is that I have lived in the same address, in the same apartment building, in the same apartment for 50 years. It'll be 50 years October 1970. I moved there in October 1973, so this October it'll be 50 years. In Woodley Park. Yes, I integrated the building. So I'll tell you about that some other time.
Welcome. So we motion to.
I'll take a motion to accept our new member. Yes. Motion. Okay. All saying yes. All agree. Yes. No nays. I'm just saying no nays. Okay, you're in. You probably don't want me running elections anywhere else, but here. I'm ahead.
We have a resounding welcome to both of you. And we have Professor William Pederson is here every year with his students. And he's a professor at LSU Shreveport, Louisiana. And he has a visiting professor with him who's been to AOI before, back when we were at the Capitol skyline, Priyash Raval. Did I pronounce your name correctly? And Bill's going to let his students introduce themselves. Every year he comes and he brings his students who are studying tourism in D.C., I believe.
Did I just stand up? Okay, my name is Matthew Coleman. I'm a history political science major at LSUS, and I'm graduating in the fall.
Great.
My name is Connor Jackson. I'm a history major, and I'm actually looking to go into my PhD program at some point, so it'll probably be about 10 years before I graduate.
Great.
And would you like to say anything, Raval? Mr. Priyash?
you want to say anything? That's good.
Okay. Well, welcome. Are there any other visitors who'd like to be introduced? Nope. Okay. Well, I close mine.
Well, I will say one special returning guest that we have, which is Tom Neal. So we're very happy to have our past president, Tom Neal, back with us after a brief time out to get healthy. So we're very happy to see you healthy and well and back here. Thanks for being back with us. We do have two milestones to mark. The passing of Mary Frances Moriarty, unfortunately, in May. She was born in D.C., grew up in Chevy Chase, and spent most of her adult life in the Northern Virginia area, getting her master's at George Mason, and did extensive community work in addition to her professional life, and raising 6 sons. And that alone, I think, should be noted for her. As well as the passing of, and I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, please correct me if anybody knows the correct pronunciation, Arsène Boucher? Boucher, correct. Boucher, okay. Who was born in Shanghai, we were just talking about Shanghai, to a Russian mother and a French father, but made D.C. his home after coming here to live with his mother, and then also attending Catholic University, and was a freelance writer for many, many years before returning back to France in 1995, but maintained his AOI membership, even though he hadn't been back here since 1995. So any of you who are moving, there's no excuse to not maintain your membership. So they will be missed. And speaking of family histories, we have a new column for our newsletter. There are some flyers in the back that are very simplified versions to encourage you and to keep it in mind as you leave, to tell us your story and your family history and your connections to DC and how you are able, basically, to be an AOI member. And we want to collect and share so that we get to know each other a little bit more, but also to preserve our members' past and history, which is one of our missions, our stated missions as an organization. So if you are willing to share a little bit of your history and a few photos or two, please take a flyer, write up a couple paragraphs, send us some pictures, and we'll start including them in our newsletter. Yes?
On that note, might you be sharing that with DCPL, with DC Public Library, with the DC Archive?
We actually, all of our newsletters do go into the archives, not at the Washingtoniana archives. Bill, am I saying that correct?
DC History Center, but I think you're referring to the oral histories or the projects.
Yeah, at DCPL.
Okay.
Big DC, Digital DC and everything. And one of our board meetings, we talked about, because we know that there are oral histories, recorded ones and all being done, and we didn't want to step on anyone's toes. But I think the idea was that we would talk with the folks at MLK to say, we're doing this, do you have a place for them as well, in addition to DC history?
Which would be really
Yes.
great.
That way you get it everywhere.
And on that note, one of the things that we hopefully, and maybe we will also talk to the library about this, we are going to be introducing something that we've actually done before, and you might remember it because one of our topics was Woodies and memories of Woodies, and that was a very popular talk. A new luncheon brunch series, an occasional one, where we all get together to share our memories of a particular topic. And then we will record that as well, and to bring, and it is tentatively titled Memories and Mimosas. So we'd like you to come and maybe use some mimosas to get those memories going as well. And we will let you know when we're going to have our first one, possibly this summer, and either at a regular lunch time or at an additional time, maybe on a weekend, or we can have a topic, because we have so much collective memory that's here that we definitely want to record that and be able to maybe pass it on to the archives. But if you have a contact or if you want to talk afterwards, let's do that and how we can keep that going. If you're around this weekend, a quick rundown of things that might interest you. If you missed the Petworth Porch Fest that was a couple weeks ago, there's an Adams Morgan Porch Fest on Saturday that you can go and hear music outside. There is a Fiesta Asia Street Fair that is going to be on Pennsylvania Avenue. And that is celebrating Asian Heritage Month, and that is Saturday during the afternoon on Pennsylvania Avenue. A little more pricey, bourbon and bluegrass over at Lincoln's Summer Cottage in Rock Creek, by Rock Creek Cemetery. You get bourbon, listen to bluegrass, for both days of this weekend. And a call to action if you are interested in letting your voice be heard. As part of a master plan from the Smithsonian, it includes demolishing the, I'm going to mispronounce this too, Haupt Garden? Haupt? Haupt. Yes, Haupt Garden. I can't pronounce it, but I do want to save it. So there is a call to write in, to sign petitions, because as part of that multi-year master plan, it is, as of right now, gone. And one of our own past members, James Good, thought that was worthy of preservation and wrote so in the Washington Post a few years ago, to no avail. Committee of 100 on their website, if you go to it, also has ways to write to the decision makers to be able to try to save it, as well as to sign an online petition. So I encourage you to look for that and learn more, and to at the very least be aware of it if it's something that you're interested in saving. On that note, the Committee of 100 also has one of their last in their series of public seminars on public spaces, and this is Reclaiming Public Spaces on May 24th. And it's literally called Reclaiming the Commons, the Value of Public Space. So if you're interested in learning more about that as well. So that's for me. I'm going to pass it over to Nelson for trivia.
Okay, we're going to go back to 1922, the evening of January 29th. In the previous 24 hours, 31 inches of snow had fallen on the city. Theater goers were discouraged from going to the theater, which was fortunate, but 300 did show up at the Knickerbocker Theater that evening. And most of them were seated, not all of them, a few of them were still being seated, when the roof collapsed from the weight of the snow on the roof. So the trivia question, we'll get to that, don't answer now. The trivia question is, how many died of the 300? Now, I wanted to get to the aftermath of all this. This was, of course, a great tragedy. There was a record snowfall. And the Reginald Gary, the architect, was sued by some of the victims, families of the victims of the tragedy. It went through the courts, but the courts all ruled, all the way up to the Supreme Court, that no, all the regulations had been adhered to, and he was not responsible for the maybe they should be upgraded, but he did adhere to all the regulations that were in force at the time. He was ruined. He couldn't practice anymore. He lapsed into depression. About 3 years after the collapse, he committed suicide. Now, Hugh Crandall, the owner of the Knickerbocker Theater, he was also had court suits, but the courts didn't hold him reliable. He also committed suicide about 5 years after the theater was collapsed. So the trivia question is, how many actually died? I'll take a fairly round number. of the 300 that were in attendance at the time. I will say that 116 were injured very severely. And the church nearby became a hospital and a morgue, temporary hospital and morgue where they were treated. So how many died in the Knickerbocker Theater? And also, if anybody has any family connections with this, or you have a quick story, and maybe you've heard something, maybe a family member was involved in some way, we'll take that quickly too. Okay, I had a hand over here.
75, I used to know.
75?
That's it.
No, that's a little higher. I'll give you a clue. It's a little higher. It's a good guess, though. 95. Well, you're getting very close. Maybe we'll give it to you. Should we give it to her?
We got one more. We had one more.
You got more?
There was one more right here.
100?
You have it. 100. Actually, it was 98, but I said I'd take a round number. So you have this. You have the surprise. You have the award. It's a little different this time. I have something in the awards from H Street, and I'd like to get a critique of from the Chili Bowl. Their sauce. Has anybody ever tried their sauce at the Ben's Chili Bowl? Okay. How is it?
I just want to mention that one of the great members of this organization, Ginny Daly, and many of you know that many of you may know Ginny Daly, who's been a longstanding member of this organization. Her father almost went into the theater that night, and he wrote the story about it that was in the Washington Star.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Yep.
is,
Well,
you should look that up and put it in your archives or something.
I have copies of a capitulation of the history that appeared in the Post last year. I have copies of that if you'd like a copy. I have some copies that I can contribute. I'd also want to mention the theater seated 1,000, and it was often full. If it hadn't been the weather like it was, it might have been a full theater. And so the tragedy could have been far, far worse. The weather discouraged people from going.
My mother was alive at that time. She was a college kid. And I was raised on that story. Every time I went to a movie theater, every time it snowed, regaled with that story. Terrible tragedy.
It was, it went on for some time. I said that, the suicides and the tragedies, there were probably others, tragedies from people that were involved with the theater that didn't have any direct responsibility, but lapsed into depression and were very sad about the whole event. Thank you.
Just a quick thing, the Adams Morgan Bid did a commemoration last year, and they have connections to people with stories.
Yes, they did. That's
Literally a family from Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's mentioned in the article. There's quite a few archives that have been put together in the last couple of years concerning the families that were involved. Anybody else?
The Knickerbocker site was rebuilt as the ambassador when I was here. It's at Columbia Road and 18th Street. And now I think there's like a plaza there over which there's a great deal of controversy because Bank of America wants to develop that site. But it was a functioning theater under a different name, a new building, when I came over.
It's mentioned that there was a church across the street from the theater that became the temporary morgue and hospital. I don't know if it's still there.
Probably the Christian Science.
Yes, it's still there.
Which is now a hotel.
No, it's gone. Okay. Is there any kind of marking of any kind on any of the sites involved with it?
There's a temporary sign on the corner, county corner from there, by the Truist Bank. There's a temporary memorial set up.
They moved
It's down by the corner.
I thought it was the history of the corner. Because it said Jimi Hendrix played there in 1967. They might have removed that temporarily while the clause is undergoing all kinds of.
Well, it's not being legal. The case is in court. So we'll see what happens.
No with that, oh boy, yeah. Okay. Like I say, I have a few copies of the article. If you'd like one, see me over here later.
I thank you for that, and I think we're going to add theaters to our memories and mimosas topics. So come back to tell us more about that. Yes, Loretta.
Well, then I just want to announce that the 100th anniversary of the opening of the Tacoma Theater is July 2nd, it was 1943, 2003. We may have an event celebrating it on Saturday instead of Sunday. That's the dates this year. Anyway, so add Tacoma to your list.
At Tacoma. A lot of things turning 100. The Avalon Theater in Chevy Chase as well. And if they are doing one movie from every decade. So if you haven't gotten over there in a while, it might be a good time to go and do that. I think Moonstruck is coming up in another week or so. Well, it is now my privilege to introduce our speaker. He has such a prolific career, I probably do not need to introduce him to you, but you may have forgotten all of the things that he has done because there have been so many. So I am going to just give you a little bit of an overview. Obviously, Ray Suarez is a journalist and an author whose next book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, will be out next April, published by Little Brown. And today he's going to be speaking on some of the topics that, at least one of the topics that he will be covering. A longtime resident of AU Park, he was the anchor of Inside Story on Al Jazeera America, senior national correspondent for the PBS News Hour, and the host of Talk of the Nation on NPR. His earlier books dealt with the history of Latino migration to the United States, the intertwining of religion and American politics, a very light subject, and the impact of white flight and suburbanization on American cities in the decades after World War II. And I believe D.C. is also one of the focus in that as well. Over the course of a long career in the news business, he's won 2 DuPont Columbia Silver Batons, an Overseas Press Club Award, and 2 Webby Awards, among many, many others. He's currently can be heard as the host of 3 podcast series: On Shifting Ground, Going for Broke, and The Things I Thought About When My Body Was Trying to Kill Me. All, I'm going to say, available on wherever podcasts are available, wherever you download or listen to them. He and his wife Carol raised 3 children here in D.C. who all now live far away, and they're not kidding, because Shanghai is one of them. So definitely far away. So thank you very much for coming to speak to us today, and I turn you over to Mr. Suarez.
Thank you for the introduction, and let me say at the outset that I have always said, not just for your benefit today, but have always said that D.C. is a funny place. I've lived here and worked here since I left Chicago in 1993, so I've used Washington as a home base. My 2 oldest kids were born in Chicago but raised here, and the baby was born in Sibley Hospital, so the only real Washingtonian in the family. Because of the work I do, I had to look out at the country and the world from the vantage point of this city, which functioned in a dual kind of way because it was also my home. So I had to think about transit and zoning and schools and where to buy groceries, and think about Washington as a place from which ripples and reverberations run to the furthest corners of the planet. Money and influence and power, military might, all of it. So mine of necessity was a bifurcated place that projected power globally and even into space, and the place we had to wake up early to tune in the radio to see if school was closed after a dusting of snow or a little freezing rain. I would get on a plane and 14 hours away in Johannesburg, visit a maternity clinic where the number of babies born HIV positive was declining because of the decisions made here in Washington about funding and distributing antiretroviral therapy, saving millions of African lives. I stood in front of the American Embassy in Rome on the Via Veneto and watched one of the largest demonstrations against nuclear weapons in history, complete with chants and banners and enormous puppets of my Uncle Sam. But I also had to wrestle with the city government over the fact that my house was on 2 lots, and for years I got 2 separate tax bills, one for a lot with a house on it, and one for an empty lot. So Washington was writ huge and also writ very, very, very small, like the size of a lot. Last week I completed the first complete draft of the manuscript for We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, and strictly personally, it's an enormous relief. But as far as my assignment for today is concerned, it also means this stuff is very much front of mind. It's been my obsession for the last several years, and it's in a very tangible way because, once again, our eyes are fixed on the southern border. The debates and decisions about immigration made here in Washington, just a few miles away from here on Capitol Hill, will ripple out from here and once again reverberate to the furthest corners of the globe. And in the case of the law I'll be discussing with you today, it changed the course of the country's demographic future. At some point in the late 2040s, a baby will be born somewhere in America who will be a kind of Virginia Dare 2.0. A milestone marker baby who will tip more than 250 years of demographic history, and for the first time, a majority of residents of the United States will trace their family's history, their ancestry, to Asia, Africa, or Latin America rather than to Europe. This strange census-created demographic category of white non-Hispanic. It's the only census category that defines you by what you're not rather than by what you are, will no longer be the majority of the residents of the United States. Here in the district, not only are we there already, we've been here for quite some time. The city hit its historic high in population in 1950 at a little over 800,000. And really, that was no wonder, as the federal government swelled to a size never imagined by the founders, and this country took on worldwide responsibilities, with military forces around the globe, the struggle against communism, and also pushing out other forms of American influence in the developing world. It was from that high peak of 1950 that the population here began to fall, and the makeup of the population began 20 years of breathtakingly rapid change. In 1940, the population of the District of Columbia was 71% white. By 1970, just 30 years later, it was 71% black. These changes were all accomplished through internal migration, as people moved in from other parts of the country and out to other parts of the country and the region, because these decades were times of really small numbers of immigrants coming to the U.S. from other places in the world. That time period from 1940 to 1970 was a time of historically low levels of immigration. And I'll talk about why in a little bit. But this strange place, D.C., this accidental place, this internal colony, ruled by people elected in other places, was not, in the modern era, an immigrant hotbed. Not a place with a large foreign-born population compared with many other American cities. If you think about it, Chinatown is kind of vestigial, and this was even before the arena. There were like 2 blocks of Little Italy, We never really had a Koreatown or a little Warsaw or anything like that. The main social drama here has always been between native-born black people and native-born white people. My church home for 30 years, St. Columba's on Albemarle and 42nd, was just a few hundred yards from the nearest Episcopal church, St. George's near Fort Reno. Why were there two Episcopal churches so close to each other? Because St. George's was all black and St. Columba's was all white. St. George's were then torn down, like the entire Fort Reno neighborhood, to make room for Jackson Reed High School, Deal Middle School, and the Reservoir. In 1960, 38,000 foreign-born people lived in the district, roughly 1 of every 20 residents, which made the district a mirror of America as a whole rather than urban America. In 1960, the decennial census made a surprising discovery. America's foreign-born population had shrunk significantly from its very high levels in the early years of the 20th century. 1890 had been the high watermark, when about 15% of U.S. residents were born outside the country. By 1960, that portion was down to 5%, and foreign-born residents were significantly older than the population as a whole. Why? How had this happened after so many thousands of boatloads of people had come down gangplanks and through Ellis Island for so many years? Well, it was kind of an accident and kind of intentional. The 1910 census has counted a huge number of foreign-born people and, of course, their children. And the 19-teens turned out to be a tumultuous decade in the life of the United States. Labor was flexing its muscle, especially among immigrant workers who made shoes and tended looms in New England, who made hats and blouses and cigars in New York, dug coal and tin in Pennsylvania, laid railroad track and brewed beer and slaughtered cows in the fast-growing cities of the Midwest. Suddenly, and I really do mean suddenly, there were Catholic churches and synagogues sprouting up everywhere, socialist and anarchist newspapers, strikes, resistance to World War I, women's suffrage campaigns, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, increased paranoia about foreign ideologies here in America, leading to a Red Scare from 1919 to 1921. Emma Goldman and other foreign-born leftists were deported. A lot of native-born leftists were simply jailed, and some, like Joe Hill, were killed. Many Americans looked at their country and laid the fault for the unrest at the feet of America's immigration policies, which had pulled in strong backs and nimble fingers and desperate people who had gotten onto boats in Hamburg and Cove and Liverpool and Bergen and Rotterdam, Naples and Palermo. And after the war was over, there was unemployment, there was recession, and more tumult. And the Congress was convinced this was enough. America had had an open door for the previous 75 years, and enough was enough. The Congress passed, the President signed the Immigration Act of 1924. And until Johnson Reed, there were virtually no limits on immigration. If you were not a fugitive from the law, if you were not physically or mentally infirm, you were in, basically. It was that easy. And remember that the next time somebody compares their immigrant ancestors favorably to today's new arrivals by saying, well, my family played by the rules. There were no rules. Let's just be honest with each other. Johnson Reed created the U.S. Border Patrol, reiterated the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then broadened it by preventing immigration and naturalization from a huge swath of Asia, severely limited the number of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and eventually based new immigration quotas not on the recently completed census of 1920, or the last pre-war census of 1910, or even 1900. Congress reached back all the way to 1890 to establish the baselines for new arrivals. At its core was an attempt to establish an idea of American homogeneity, giving preference to Europeans, yes, but also giving particular preference to Europeans from Northern and Western Europe in particular, and making Asian migration close to difficult and naturalization literally impossible. The Johnson in Johnson Reed, Albert Johnson of Washington State, said the new law would protect the U.S. against what he called a stream of alien blood. The law reduced immigration by 80% from the annual averages before the First World War. The sponsors and the president who signed the new law, Calvin Coolidge, could not have imagined what was waiting out there in the future, which really severely throttled immigration. First, a devastating global depression beginning in 1929, and a war that left much of the planet locked down from 1939 to 1945, and a war that left much of the planet in ruins after 1945, from Bristol to Rotterdam to Berlin to Stalingrad, when the smoke cleared. The foreign-born Americans counted in the 1960 census were basically the little kids who arrived with their parents from the Tsarist Empire and Ireland and Sicily and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19aughts and the 19-teens, now grown into maturity. And the baby boom swelled the ranks of native-born Americans, making immigrants a small and aging part of the population. But this country was not only in the midst of an economic boom with rising labor costs at the time. We were, by the early 1960s, in the middle of a worldwide political and social struggle, a Cold War against the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, trying to demonstrate the superiority of the American way of life and our fidelity to the ideals of equality under law and free economic aspiration, the pursuit of happiness. In the propaganda war against the Soviets, you can be sure Little Rock and Selma and Montgomery and the segregation right here in the nation's capital was covered by TASS, the official press agency headquartered in Moscow, but not only for a Soviet audience, but distributing content daily over the news wires to a decolonizing world in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean. Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson were keenly aware of how this country's inability to guarantee equal rights under law to its black citizens looked to populations in newly self-governing capitals in Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and many more. A Brooklyn congressman, a grandson of German immigrants named Emanuel Seller, and a senator from Wisconsin, a grandson of Irish immigrants named Phil Hart, sponsored the Hart-Celler Act to sweep away the Eurocentric quota formulas, reformulate U.S. immigration policy, and deracialize U.S. immigration policies. Because in 1965, an immigration regime that favored Europe to the exclusion of other places in the world inherently heavily favored white immigration to the United States, which was a bad look at the UN and on the front lines of the Cold War. Congressman Seller said of his law, 40 years of testing have proven that the rigid pattern of discrimination not only produced imbalances that have irritated many nations, but Congress itself, through a long series of enactments forced by the realities of a changing world, saw fit to modify this unworkable formula so that today it remains on the books primarily as an expression of gratuitous condescension. In 1960, if you took the top 10 birth nations of foreign-born Americans, 9 of them sent only white immigrants to the United States. If you look at the 2020 census and the top 10 birth nations of foreign-born Americans today, 9 of them send primarily non-white immigrants to the United States, and only 1, Canada, sends primarily white immigrants. So yes, there was a national and ethnic dimension to the effect of this law, but also fundamentally a racial one. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson's helicopter set down on the broad lawn stretching from the base of the Statue of Liberty to sign Hart-Celler. Surrounded by dignitaries from New York State and the Congress, he said, and you know, since we're all that age, you can kind of hear Lyndon Johnson's voice in your head and that accent. He said, men of needed skill and talent, of course, in 1965, he wouldn't say people, it's men of needed skill and talent, who apparently had women coming along with them too, were denied entrance because they came from Southern or Eastern Europe or one of the developing continents. This system violated the basic principle of American democracy, the principle that values and rewards each man, again, on the basis of merit as a man. It has been un-American in the highest sense because it has been untrue to the faith that brought thousands to these shores even before we were a country. Today, with my signature, this system is abolished. We can now believe that it will never again shadow the gate of the American nation with the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege. Pretty good stuff for a windy speech in the middle of New York Harbor. Back in Washington, leading up to this celebration at the accidental symbol of America's welcome to immigrants. It's a rant for another day, but Bartholdi designed and sculpted the Statue of Liberty to represent the abolition of slavery, not immigration. The Congress's journey toward passage had been a bumpy one. In these days of near 50-50 Congresses, it's hard to remember that there were, in the 89th Congress, which was elected in November 1964, 68 Democratic senators. It's kind of scrambles your eggs, the idea that any one party could have 68 senators. There were 295 Democrats in the House, a comfortable 150-seat majority. At first glance, it might look like Democrats really didn't have to debate anything. They could simply steamroll ahead with whatever they wanted to do and not give Republicans a second thought. But since this is the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants, I know you know better. That 68-seat Democratic caucus in the Senate nominally were members of one party, but it hid the fact, that D label hid the fact that it was really kind of two parties hiding under that label. Think about it. Oklahoma, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia, Missouri, and Alabama all had 2 Democratic senators. And Vermont and California both had 2 Republican senators. The party of John Sparkman of Alabama, Harry F. Byrd of Virginia, James Eastland and John Stennis of Mississippi was also the party of Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, Robert Kennedy of New York, and George McGovern of South Dakota. There was no way that today men as different as that group would find themselves in the same party. But further complicating the matter, senators well to the left of Byrd and Eastland, Jacob Javits of New York, Leverett Saltonstall of Massachusetts, Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, were all Republican senators. A similar, if somewhat more granular, situation prevailed in the House. In that Congress, the entire Texas delegation in the House were Democrats, along with just about all the members of the House from Louisiana, Kentucky, and South Carolina. Many of these men were, believe it or not overjoyed about the prospect of more immigrants coming to the United States, more non-white immigrants in particular. The South never had an Ellis Island era. It was the most uniformly native-born region of the United States. And since we have LSU guests here, I have to stipulate that the great asterisk of generalizations about the South was in those days Louisiana is now Louisiana and Florida. But in general, the South was the most uniformly native-born region of the United States, and it was going to take arm twisting to get Hart-Celler over the finish line, even with those enormous Democratic majorities. Phil Hart began to back away from the legislation that bore his own name, and Teddy Kennedy became its Democratic champion in the Senate with backup from one of the greatest legislative tacticians of the 20th century, LBJ himself, hitting the phones to twist arms and provide, when necessary, the famed Johnson treatment. Trips on Air Force One, visits to the home state or district promised for wavering congressmen. Both Senator Kennedy and President Johnson assured wavering Democratic members of both chambers that the law wouldn't change much about America. Kennedy said the new law would not remake the population of the big cities, would not bring big changes in the workforce. And it's hard to say whether both men or neither man really believed that part of the overall pitch. But there was a fast-growing economy in the 1960s. The beginning of a baby bust was beginning to take shape. And long lines, figuratively, of people who aspired to come from places the 1924 law had closed the door on. From Asia, riven by Cold War conflict, not yet the Asian tigers of later decades. From Latin America, where left and right were locked in battles that would continue for decades and send aspirational people north. From the Middle East and Africa, the seeds of the demographic flip heading our way in the 2040s were sown by that vote in 1965. Period. Latinos increased from 4% of the U.S. population in 1965 to almost 20% today. Asians, a kind of catch-all term that aggregates people from 40% of the world's population and has some real problems as a term, they came roaring up from decades of legal exclusion and discrimination to become 20 million strong today. When the act was signed, even with the discriminatory laws in place for the previous 80 years, there was an Asian population in the U.S., heavily Japanese and Chinese at the time. Today, South Asians, people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Thais, and others, outnumber Chinese and Japanese in the United States. And in a huge historical change, in a kind of vindicating, wonderful historical change, after 2 centuries when virtually all people from Africa came to this part of the world as property, to be worked without pay for their whole lives, and to have the expectation that the same would prevail for their children, followed by a century of legal exclusion and discrimination, sub-Saharan Africans began to arrive in greater and greater numbers, giving America a chance and asking America in return for a chance. Today, remarkably, 1 in 10 black residents of the United States is an immigrant. 1 in 5 is either an immigrant or the child of black immigrants. What has this law, which doesn't really get talked about much for a lot of good reasons, as much as the contemporary civil rights acts, for instance? I mean, we talk a lot more about the other legislative action from that string of years. What has that law done in the district? Well, the Hart-Celler law took full effect by 1968, so you were unlikely to see much change as early as the 1970 census. So let's use 1970 as a baseline. DC's population was, as I noted, overwhelmingly native-born, overwhelmingly made up of black Americans and whites not of Hispanic ancestry. In 1970, the census found 0.6% of the population was of Asian descent. Today, it's 8 times higher. DC was about 2% Latino in 1970. That's grown by 500% since. And the city's foreign-born population now resembles that of the U.S. as a whole at about 13.5%. In short, that famed city of northern charm and southern efficiency, almost entirely native-born like the American South, has become more diverse, more cosmopolitan, better able to claim the label global city. And when you add in the Maryland suburbs, the New Hampshire Avenue corridor and Rockville Pike commercial zones, fast-growing immigrant communities in Northern Virginia, you can truly say this metropolitan area has felt the impact of Hart-Celler, which will soon mark its 60th anniversary. For all this becoming more like the rest of the country in the modern era, the district is still distinct in some ways. Its immigrant populations were shaped by the final chapters of the Cold War, which gave it a very unusual profile compared to other big metros in the country. For much of the post-war era, Latino populations had regional flavors. Miami and New York were largely Caribbean. Texas and California had large, both homegrown and immigrant Mexican populations. D.C. was unique in its more Central American and South American immigrant profile, as late Cold War tumult in places like El Salvador and Honduras, and economic troubles and the subsequent chain migration from places like Bolivia made D.C. a more Latino city and one very distinct from other East Coast metros. Chain migration, organized church and refugee aid groups helped people fleeing the civil wars that were ravaging the Horn of Africa. And a trend like that tends to build on itself if you follow immigration patterns. So Ethiopians, Somalis, and Eritreans in large numbers began to call this region home. This creates some interesting 21st century demands to shift and reimagine what labels and identities really mean. A Somali cab driver looked in the rearview mirror and recognized me as I slid into the back seat. Cab drivers, it should be noted, all over America are great fans of public broadcasting because it's the only place they can find regular overseas coverage. And he said he wanted my opinion on something. He said his son, a student at a D.C. public high school, had to fill out paperwork. And, you know, if you've had a kid in D.C. public high schools, you know there's paperwork involved. And it asked for racial and ethnic information, and so his son checked off African American. This gentleman, who had come to the United States from Somalia as a refugee, was highly agitated about this. Now, what was the play for me, his passenger, who wanted to reach a destination safely, wanted to count a new fan in the Horn of Africa population? I asked, well, was your son born here, or did he come with you and your wife? The driver said he was born after they arrived. So I said, well, he probably has a better claim to being African American than all of his other classmates. I mean, both his parents are from Africa, and he was born in America. So he's literally African American. This, it turned out, was not the right answer. He is not African American. You know that that's not what they mean on the form. And it became clear this Somali immigrant saw his son's black classmates as Americans of a very different sort from his own son. So I said, well, what did you want him to put on the form? He answered, he is an African. But that wasn't one of the choices. But it was a fascinating encounter. And it's a reminder that as the number of Jamaicans, Ethiopians, Barbadians, Vincentians, Nigerians, Liberians, and Senegalese in America continues to grow, the immigrants themselves and their children born in this country will have to navigate all the deep questions that any immigrants and their children have to face about identity and belonging and status and self-concept, and have added on an added layer of history that they have to carry around with them and make sense of for themselves as they deal with this country's long story and this country's long racial neurosis that far predates when their families first got here. Just a few generations since dogs were set on protesters and crowds came to jeer frightened teenagers integrating high schools. Just a blink of an eye in historical terms since Virginia counties closed their public schools entirely rather than integrate them as ordered by the Supreme Court. The unfolding drama of American immigration also has to include that growing African component. Africans are among the aspiring refugees showing up at the southern border. Counterintuitively, if you ask people, well, who do you think's coming in down there? Who do you think's coming and presenting themselves for asylum? They're in Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez and Nogales. Typically, stereotypically, perhaps we think of them as Mexicans and Central Americans, but now they include large numbers of Cubans and Venezuelans and Ukrainians, along with West Africans who book cheap one-way tickets to Brazil from West Africa, look at a map, and begin heading north. Just as in 1924, when Congress tried to keep the door open only a crack to let in favored immigrants and keep others out, we are now going to have a national reckoning about who we are as a people, what our history really teaches us, and what we want our values to show to the world. Right at this moment, with the widespread speculation about the Great Replacement and anxiety about the future of white people in America, we are not showing our best selves to each other or to the rest of the world. To turn people fleeing a vicious civil war in Syria into terrorist suspects, which is what we basically did. For a president of the United States to wonder why more Norwegians don't come here when so many Nigerians do, when the highest-rated program host on American cable television went on the air nightly to spread lurid fantasies about the diseased, dirty, and criminal people who come here from the rest of the world, we have a problem. In 2010, for the first time ever, the majority of children born in American hospitals were not whites of European ancestry, and it's been true every year since then. So that maternity ward class of 2010 is now on the verge of high school. In a few years, those kids will be applying for college and entering the military. If we listened to the hysterics of the Great Replacement crowd and reduced immigration to zero, even if we did what they wanted and reduced immigration to zero, it would only postpone the arrival of Virginia Dare 2.0. It would not cancel that date with our future. That cake is baked. And we as a nation can either make this demographic transition hard or we can make it easy. I wrote the book, which I hope you read when it comes out next April, because I saw worrying signs in the way we're handling both the legal, the kind of hardware around immigrants and immigration, and the software, the way we think about and dream about and imagine immigration and immigrants. But there is an undoubted case to be made. They enrich America, that they always have, and now that they are mainly non-white, that's not going to change. One of the most amazing Washington spectacles of recent years was the first Trump impeachment, when 3 star witnesses to the president's attempts to muscle Ukraine for his own personal political reasons were Masha Yovanovitch, Canadian-born daughter of Russian exiles, Alexander Vindman, born in Ukraine, who came to this country courtesy of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment during the Cold War, and Fiona Hill, born and raised in County Durham in northern England. Here they were, in the highest drama arena of American life, making the case to the U.S. Senate for the removal from office of an American president. All naturalized Americans. They are us. And one of the most elegant of the so-called House managers, the prosecutors from the House of Representatives making the case against the president in the second impeachment, was Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado, whose parents came to the U.S. from what was then Ethiopia, is now Eritrea, who would not have been here at all if not for the work of his predecessors in the Congress, making it possible for his parents to resettle in this country. I was just living in China before finishing the final chapters of this book. China is a place that takes almost no immigrants, believes in a kind of Han ethnic essentialism, is hard at work trying to homogenize a very diverse people, and it's a country that will have a shortage of workers in the coming decades because of the one-child policy. People are not rushing to try to move into China. We are different. Even if we haven't always embraced being different, even if we haven't always realized that we are different in that way. It's embedded in our DNA and will remain so, whether we like it or not. Thanks for having me today, and if there's time, happy to take your questions.
I think we have Bill coming around with a microphone if you have questions. And if you could please identify yourself when you ask a question, that would be helpful for us too. I think John's the first one.
Hi. Is it working? Working, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good, yeah. My name is John Richardson. A question, would you tell us a little bit about your family's contribution to this fascinating mélange?
Well, I would like to, I guess it's immodest to say I'm part of their contribution, but my family came here in the early 1950s from a place that a lot of Americans don't realize is part of the United States, but Puerto Rico very much is. And I grew up in a largely immigrant neighborhood in Brooklyn where after open school night, the next morning we would all be talking about which of our classmates had to accompany their parents to school in order to translate what outstanding scholars they were, as the teacher explained what was going on in school. Those unlucky kids were many, even though we like to tell ourselves a story about those older generations of immigrants that include that they always learned English and they always learned it right away and all that. There were working languages on the streets of my Brooklyn childhood that were not English. It is as someone who thinks a lot about history and writes a lot about history, it is remarkable to me that in one lifetime that I got to see America through this change. I covered the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which gave amnesty to 3 million undocumented people in the United States, and it was hoped at that time that would be it, that we wouldn't then allow the number of undocumented to balloon. But if, this was an economic question, not a legal one. So I've been living across the country in Chicago and Los Angeles and Philadelphia and here, grew up in New York, and through both strands of my kids' families, there is the memory of recent enough immigrant origins and people who spoke with accents and people who spoke other languages and on and on and on. So it gives you a kind of interesting view of the country where my forebears didn't have to do anything but get on a plane They didn't, in those days, you didn't even have to show a driver's license or, real ID or anything. There were companies selling one-way tickets from San Juan to Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, and you would fly on the equivalent of a cargo plane. It was basically cargo in the back and folding chairs bolted to the floor in the front, and for $17 to $25, you could fly from San Juan to New York. And a bunch came in the late 30s, just before the war started, and the rest came in the early 50s.
I'm Chip Carlson, and what you were saying about your family and so forth reminded me of a dear friend of mine, Penina Coleman. Oh, can you hear me?
There you go.
All right, so I got to eat the microphone. All right, so I had a dear friend of mine, Penina Cohen, and we were talking about our ancestries, and I said, well, my family came over in the Mayflower. She says, well, I can beat that. My parents came over on 707.
Thank you. Very, very impressive. I heard this general statistic some years ago, and I don't know the source, but at some point within the last decade, there turned out to be more native-born Africans immigrating into the U.S. than are ancestors of slaves and the enslaved population. So there's a new, larger African-born population than long-living African-American population. Is that accurate?
The ratios are such that, there are the largest number of African-born people entering the country since at any time since the early 19th century, partially because the quotas put in place by the 1924 Immigration and Nationality Act made it really hard to come here. People did in some numbers. Obviously, Sidney Poitier, who was from the Bahamas, and Harry Belafonte, whose parents came from the Caribbean, Marcus Garvey. There were people making it to the United States, but they were a fairly small number. But now, for the first time, after 1965, large numbers, like other parts of the world, of African-descended people were coming to the U.S. The larger number is still Caribbean, but the people who are crunching the numbers say that will flip in the coming years. But there are, tens of thousands of Barbadians, Vincentians, Trinidadians in places like Brooklyn, Boston, Hartford, New Haven, and South Florida.
Thank you. Anna Fierst. I just wanted to point out that the last of the baby boom as in baby boom women who were able to have children, petered out in the late 1990s. So we have community colleges now that are cratering. We don't have the labor supply that we need. So why is the business community not sort of driving this immigration debate a little bit more sharply? I don't hear their voice. They need workers desperately, and I just don't hear much. It doesn't come out in the press anyway.
Well, in recent decades, the national voice of the business community, the employers' organizations, the chambers of commerce, both locally and nationally, have been largely, not exclusively, but largely aligned with the Republican Party. And they've been kind of sotto voce as the Republican Party has been less pro-immigrant. And the Republican caucuses in the House and Senate have not favored coming to terms with the Democrats and hammering out a compromise, even on some of the easier parts of all of this. Take as an example, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. That was thought for a long time to be the low-hanging fruit of the immigration debate, that people who came in arms as babies, who didn't have the initiative and didn't immigrate illegally themselves, were considered more sympathetic characters, and many of them even have no conscious memory of ever having lived in another country, that regularizing their status, giving them some sort of pathway to citizenship was thought to be easier than comprehensive immigration reform for the other 12 million people who are living here undocumented. They can't even do DACA. They can't even, converge around 700,000, a relatively small number of people who are business owners and college students. And, I interview for the book a guy who is a Houston Fire Department EMT and a DACA recipient. And the only reason he's even able to be an EMT is because of DACA, because previous to that, Texas would not allow him to get a driver's license. And of course, you can't be an EMT if you can't drive. So there are hundreds of thousands of examples like that. And it's basically the political gridlock that's made it impossible, and the perceived short-term and medium-term advantage of not solving the problem that's kept things ossified. But quietly, the business community is all for fixing this and coming up with a plan that ensures not only a continued supply of young workers who will also have babies, unlike native-born people. Right now, the fertility rate among American women is very low. But they will also not be living on the edge. H-1B visa recipients who have to have demonstrated skill and industrial sponsor, a corporate sponsor here in the United States. It's sort of a new form, a 21st century form of indentured servitude. If your H-1B visa expires or your employer closes up shop or lays you off, you have to leave. Talk to Indian workers who make up a big chunk of the H-1B visa recipients, and they are always living right on the edge, not sure whether they should buy a house, not sure where they can, what communities they should live in when they may have to just pick up and go if the business climate changes. There have been, for instance, you've probably heard about very, very large layoffs in the tech sector, and a lot of current H-1B visa holders are in real jeopardy of being sent back to wherever they come from. They're never really allowed to securely, longitudinally, in a longitudinally stable way, make their homes here, even though they're highly educated, highly skilled, and highly desirable people.
Connor Jackson, and I have kind of a two-part question. So the changing demographics, specifically here in America, but also industrialization and different factors around the world, do you believe that there's been a lack of spotlight on demographics within the field of history, and that going forward there may be more?
If you couldn't hear, do I feel that there's been a spotlight on demographics in the field of history? There are, it's more likely to show up in the work of economic historians than in people who cover social questions.
I mean, do you think there's been a lack of it in terms of... Yeah.
There's a stunning lack of it. I mean, how can you analyze, for instance, the Brexit vote without trying to understand the impact of immigrants to the United Kingdom from South Asia, the Caribbean, and West Africa? Yes, of course, economic migrants from the rest of the European Union, the legendary Polish plumbers and Latvian house painters, certainly they made their appearance on the xenophobic debate stage as well. but the rising anxiety about British identity, such as it was driven by people who were visibly not of the British Isles, which a Polish plumber doesn't necessarily stick out on a street in Bristol or Coventry the way a Nigerian does. I was interviewing the head of a British Immigrant Aid Society the day after the Brexit vote, and she was quite upset when we began our interview. She was in a studio in London because on her way walking to the studio while waiting for the light to change, somebody passed her by on the street. She's a British Indian born in London, and the person said to her, well, you can bugger off home now. Because of that assumption that if you are visibly not Scottish, English, or Welsh in your long-term ancestry, you were somehow an alien. These are very deep questions about identity that drive history. You know, I hope there are historians and sociologists watching the trajectory of the 1 million Syrians in Germany today. Angela Merkel, in a really astonishing move, welcomed in the people that other countries made a point of not even allowing to touch their soil. I suspect that in the long haul, Germany will prosper from that. But in the short haul, there's growing pains and there's difficulty. Historians are missing a bet if they're not watching that closely. Certainly France, the home of one of the most vicious, xenophobic, disgustingly racist novels in modern history, Camp of the Saints by Gérard Raspail. That same France is a place which is naturally home to large numbers of North Africans, Caribbeans, and West Africans, and France is having problems with that. That's something historians have to understand. That's something historians have to watch. Or else, every year France gives an award for the best baguette in France. Because, of course, they do. And this year, the winner of the best baguette in France bakery was Sri Lankan. Now, you can either think that's cool or you can think it's terrible. And there are no shortage of French people who probably think it's terrible. And historians are missing something important if they don't watch that too.
Cindy, time for what, one more? Or what?
Exactly.
Hi, I'm Jean Stewart, and I'm interested in your views on what I see as a proximate change in immigration, migration, which has already begun in many places, and that's environmental migration. There's already some of it in people from African countries that are experiencing serious drought, and I believe there are some, on our southern border where people can't farm anymore because it doesn't rain anymore in Guatemala where they're living, etc. But I'm just wondering if you have heard any serious discussions from responsible people about changes that need to be made not only in our broken immigration system, but in other countries as well, to cope with what is probably going to be a much wider number of people migrating because of climate issues.
There are absolutely people talking about it, worrying about it, writing about it, studying it, thinking about it, but it hasn't gone wide yet. It's not the thing that people talk about when they talk about climate change. Now, there are places in the world where the environment has changed significantly over long periods of time. For instance, if you go to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the people there just picked up and went somewhere else when the patterns of the rains changed in such a way that made having a farming community there unsustainable. The difference is that now it's going to happen in dozens of places at once, and the world has 8 billion people and has borders all over the place and is a very tight, the world is tight now. So as Somalia, for instance, the southern parts of Somalia, large numbers of those communities are not sustainable as agriculturally based communities. The rains are intermittent, unreliable, sometimes they fail for years at a time. In the old world, you would just pick up and go somewhere else where it does rain. In this new world, it's impossible to just pick up and go somewhere else where it does rain. They're just going to stop you, or they're going to kill you, or they're going to set up barriers, or they're going to push you back. And that's going to happen in all kinds of places in the coming 20, 30 years. At the State Department, there were people calling Syria and the Syrian war the first big climate change war. And there are going to be plenty of others. As you mentioned, Guatemala, a lot of the Guatemalans showing up at the southern border are agricultural workers. They're not from small towns and cities in Guatemala who are just having trouble finding work. They are people from agricultural communities who simply cannot make a living any longer on the land. And if we think we can escape this, yeah, well, we can escape it for a while maybe, but not as a permanent state of play. And the American West is drying up. The Colorado River does not reach the Gulf of California anymore. A trickle of water comes out of the Colorado into the Gulf of California. It used to be one of the most astonishingly biodiverse places. Now the salinity of the Gulf of California goes up year after year. Several key species have already disappeared because the environment there is changing, because no more fresh water comes in from the Colorado. The draw is oversubscribed by all the states that border the river as it makes its way to the Gulf. You know, multiply that by 20 times. The loss of agricultural land in Bangladesh, a country the size of Wisconsin with 140 million people, and the rising waters of the delta there eat away at coastal land, increase salinization, make more land inhospitable for farming. It's something we're going to have to talk about, and it's something we're going to have some sort of answer for as countries that are more environmentally fragile become increasingly uninhabitable, even for small populations. Places like the Seychelles, the Maldives, the Comoros, places, you know, watermen in the Chesapeake are talking about how the land that their docks are built on is falling into the bay. So if we think that it's just a faraway problem that Somalis have to worry about, we're kidding ourselves. But it's the hidden problem, because we think about and we worry about and we enforce only the most obvious parts of these questions and are delaying or trying to avoid talking about the deeper ones. If you think that 1.5 billion Chinese, 800 million of them in the eastern part of the country, are going to compete with each other for land and resources while an empty Soviet Union sits next door, I mean, you know, I guess you're welcome to that idea, but as Russia continues its slow motion demographic collapse with declining birth rates, declining life expectancy, declining number of people of childbearing age, the idea that basically the emptiest part of that country is just going to happily and quietly sit unbothered while people are fighting for land and water just south of there, history is not a good guide for that being the outcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for not only giving us a lot to think about, but to look forward to reading about and when the book comes out for next year. And I want to give you the certificate of appreciation.
Thank you.
For AOI things. We're being directed. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time out to come and to speak to us truly about something that is not only impacts us here in D.C., but of course around the world and will impact all of us as we go. Next month, we have Martin Muller, who's coming. He's the editor of the last couple editions of the AIA Guide to Washington, and he's going to be talking about modern architecture in Washington, which should be really interesting to hear about and to see. I've heard him speak before, and he's a fabulous speaker. So we are on a string of absolutely fabulous speakers, so please come back, see us again. Thank you for coming, and stay safe out there.